Why did the hall fall silent when her name was called? The ceremony was supposed to be a celebration of courage. Rows of uniforms filled the space, medals catching the light, brass buttons glinting like mirrors of tradition. Soldiers, veterans, cadets, officers, all sitting rigid, their eyes trained on the stage. The air smelled faintly of polish and old wood, the kind of scent that clings to places where history insists on being remembered. Then came the name, Sergeant First Class Emily Carter. At once, murmurs spread like wildfire through the crowd. She doesn't look like a warrior. Probably just a clerk. Bet she typed reports, never carried a rifle. A few chuckled outright. Others shook their heads in silence, uncomfortable but unwilling to speak against the tide of dismissive voices. Some simply stared, their expressions unreadable. She rose from her seat slowly, calm, steady, unshaken by the whispers pressing against her like a current. Her uniform was neat but modest. No rows of gleaming ribbons across her chest, no display that screamed of campaigns survived or medals earned. Just a single understated pin, barely visible from where most of them sat. To the crowd she looked ordinary, too ordinary for this stage. But Emily Carter had lived anything but an ordinary life. She walked toward the podium with the same unhurried patience she had carried through battlefields most of them would never see. She carried herself not with swagger but with quiet dignity, the kind of strength that doesn't announce itself but settles into a room like weight. The murmurs didn't stop. They rose, clung to her like smoke, following her to the microphone. She adjusted the stand. The silence that followed wasn't respect, it was expectation. Many waited for her to falter, to stumble, to prove them right. Would she? Her hands didn't tremble, her face didn't flinch. What the crowd didn't know, not yet, was that this woman had once crawled through fire with another soldier's blood soaking her uniform, that she had whispered words in languages not her own just to calm a dying child, that she had carried men twice her size across rocky ground, bullets snapping the dirt at her heels. But she didn't say any of that, not yet. Instead, her mind drifted, unbidden, back to Tennessee, back to the farm where she was born, where every sunrise came with chores waiting, where her brothers laughed when she tried to keep pace, where her father shook his head when she talked about enlisting. "You're built for books, not battle," he'd told her. But books couldn't calm the restlessness in her chest. Books couldn't silence the pull of something bigger than herself. At 19, against her family's wishes, she signed her name on the dotted line and stepped into a world that would break her down before it built her up. Basic training had been her first battlefield. The jeers came quickly. Too small, too weak, won't last a week. She carried those words on ruck marches, through obstacle courses, into nights where exhaustion turned barracks cruel. She never shouted back, never tried to argue with the skeptics. She learned early that silence, when paired with persistence, was a weapon stronger than retorts. So she kept running. When her hands tore open on the ropes, she taped them and climbed again. When her pack cut into her shoulders, she leaned forward and kept walking. When her lungs burned, she refused to stop. Her drill sergeants noticed. They called it quiet determination. She didn't brag, she didn't complain, she just refused to quit. That silence would become her armor. Afghanistan. The word alone carried weight even years later. For Emily, it was no abstraction. It was dust in the teeth, heat pressing against the skin, helicopters chopping the sky at dawn. It was the sharp pop of gunfire, the sudden crackle of radio static, the pounding in her chest when calls for medic split the air. She had feared one thing, not being fast enough, not getting there in time. Her aid bag was never just a piece of gear. It was an extension of her body. She knew every pocket, every vial, every bandage by memory. Where others carried rounds, she carried life. And yet, standing here at this podium, they still whispered. They still mocked. Would you have joined in? Or would you have sat in silence, uncertain, waiting to see if she could prove them wrong? The cadet in the second row leaned sideways, his voice carrying too far. "Why is she even up there?" The words bounced off polished wood. A few nodded. A veteran muttered, "Back in my day, this wouldn't happen." Emily Carter straightened her papers, adjusted the microphone. Not a flicker of emotion crossed her face. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was patience. Because she had been here before, on patrols where trust meant survival, in alleys where doubt could kill, in tents where hands pressed against wounds while seconds decided fates. She had been here before, judged before the truth revealed itself. But the truth always revealed itself, eventually. As she stood, her sleeve slipped just enough to reveal the faint, jagged scar running across her forearm. Most missed it, but one veteran in the third row froze. He had seen scars like that before, scars not made in kitchens or farms, but by explosions, by shrapnel, by the fire of war. His posture changed. He leaned forward, no longer dismissive. Whispers shifted. Who was she really? The paracord bracelet on her wrist caught another pair of eyes. A simple strip, frayed, worn, engraved with two letters, JR. To most, nothing more than an accessory. But to those who knew, paracord wasn't decoration. Sometimes it was memorial. Sometimes it was all that remained. And still she said nothing. Emily Carter had learned that silence can break louder than words. That patience, carried long enough, forces even the most doubtful to question themselves. The cadet whispered again, louder this time, "I don't get it, why her?" The question hung in the air. The answer didn't come, not yet. Because the truth wasn't in the words she prepared. It wasn't in the neat pages stacked before her. The truth lived in the firestorms of Kandahar, in the weight of another soldier slung over her shoulders, in the taste of blood and dust, in the burning scar she covered with fabric so the world wouldn't have to stare. She didn't need to explain herself, not yet. But she would. And when she did, no one in that hall would laugh again. For now she simply stood, silent, steady, waiting. The hall's air thickened, the whispers circling, building like a storm not yet broken. Some still chuckled. Others leaned in, sensing something deeper. A veteran muttered to himself, almost afraid to believe the thought forming in his mind. Carter, wasn't there a Carter in Kandahar? The name dropped like a stone, ripples spread. A few frowned, trying to remember. Kandahar, that place, that hell. The hall held its breath. Emily Carter didn't move, didn't answer. Because sometimes silence is the loudest sound of all. What did she remember in that silence? Her eyes stayed fixed on the papers before her, but her mind was no longer in the polished hall. It was somewhere else, somewhere hot, raw, and filled with the scent of dust and burning fuel. Afghanistan, Kandahar. The whispers in the hall blurred into the crackle of a radio. The polished wooden floor turned into dry, rocky dirt beneath her boots. The murmured laughter faded into the sharp pop of gunfire. Her heart remembered before her lips could ever explain. She had been 24 when the deployment orders came. She had packed her bag with a precision that bordered on ritual. Bandages, syringes, morphine. Every item had a place. She had tested the zippers twice, checked the pouches again, not because she feared forgetting, but because she knew the margin of error was zero. On the plane ride over, she had stared at the desert from above, an endless stretch of ochre and beige. It looked empty, lifeless. She hadn't yet learned how full it really was, of echoes, of shadows, of ghosts. The first time someone shouted, "Medic," her body had moved before her brain had caught up. The call wasn't a request. It was a demand, one that pulled her across open ground, bullets snapping nearby, adrenaline drowning fear. She had knelt beside a soldier whose leg was shredded by shrapnel, her hands trembling only for a second before training took over. Tourniquet pressure, reassure him. "Stay with me, you're not going anywhere." Her voice had been steady, even when her inside screamed. He had looked at her, eyes wild, clinging to the calm in her tone as much as to the bandages pressing against his wound. That was the first, but not the last. She had feared one thing above all: being too late, not getting there in time. That fear rode with her on every patrol. She carried it like she carried her aid bag, close, heavy, always within reach. And now in this hall, as the cadets smirked and veterans muttered, she felt that same fear gnaw faintly inside her. Not fear of failure, but fear of misunderstanding. That they would never know. That the story of the men she had carried would die quiet, buried under their laughter. Her hand brushed her wrist, the paracord bracelet worn smooth by years. J.R. Private Jason Rivera, his name engraved not on her lips but on her skin. She had worn it since 2010. She hadn't taken it off since. The cadet in the front row whispered again, impatient. She probably never even carried a ruck. Emily Carter didn't look up. She didn't need to. Instead, she remembered. It had been a convoy that day. Trucks rumbling through the valley, tires grinding dust into clouds. The sun pressed hard, relentless, turning every shadow into a place of suspicion. They were an hour from base when the world cracked open. The blast came from nowhere, a roar of fire and metal. The lead vehicle shredded, flames curling into the air. The concussion had knocked her flat, ears ringing, vision blurred. And then the shouting, the screaming, the chaos. She hadn't hesitated. Her boots pounded the ground, her lungs clawing for air thick with smoke. Bodies moved in every direction, some ducking, some firing, some frozen. She wasn't firing. She wasn't ducking. She was running straight into the fire. Rivera had been down, blood seeping fast. She had pressed her hands against his chest, the heat of the flames biting at her skin. He had been whispering something she couldn't make out. She didn't stop. She didn't look back. She worked. Tourniquet, bandage, reassure, drag him if you must. She had dragged him, through dirt, through blood, through gunfire that cracked the ground inches away. Not until the last wounded man is safe. That was what she had told them when they begged her to leave him. And now, years later, here she stood in a hall filled with people who thought she was nothing more than a desk medic. The irony pressed heavy against her chest. Her fingers brushed the scar on her arm beneath the sleeve, the one the explosion had carved into her skin. She had never shown it, never flaunted it. To her, it wasn't proof of bravery, it was just survival. But survival has its own truth, whether people believe it or not. The hall was restless. Some eyes narrowed now, noticing the scar, the bracelet, the silence that felt too deliberate to be nervousness. A veteran leaned toward another, whispering. Carter, wasn't there a Carter in Kandahar? The name rippled through the seats. Some shook their heads unsure. Some frowned, trying to remember. The cadets didn't know. They were too young, too far removed. But the older veterans, the ones who had been there or close enough to remember, shifted uneasily in their seats. Her silence was becoming something else. Not weakness, not timidity, but gravity. And still she didn't speak. Because she knew what most people never understand. Sometimes the truth doesn't need to be declared. Sometimes it just waits. And when it arrives, it lands heavier than any argument ever could. Her silence held the weight of nights spent with her knees in the dirt, pressing cloth into wounds that wouldn't stop bleeding. Of whispers spoken in Pashto to frighten children so they wouldn't pull away while she stitched their skin. Of the long ride back to base, sitting beside soldiers who would never speak again, her hands still sticky with their blood. Could words capture that? Could any speech prove it? No, but silence could. The cadet who had mocked her leaned back in his chair, arms folded, still unconvinced. The veteran beside him clenched his jaw, doubt softening into something else. Respect. Not yet, but curiosity. Emily Carter adjusted the microphone one last time. She could feel the hall teetering between skepticism and revelation, the air thick with questions no one dared to ask outright. What was she hiding? Why did her scars look like that? Whose name was carved into that bracelet? Why did her silence feel heavier than their laughter? She inhaled slowly. The truth wasn't far now, it was coming. And when it arrived, it would shatter every whisper in that hall. But for now, she let the silence stretch. Let it test them. Let it press down on their shoulders until the weight of their own doubt became unbearable. Because she knew, better than anyone, that silence can hold more power than any speech. And in that silence the hall began to break. Doubt cracked, curiosity seeped in, respect hovered, waiting to be born. Emily Carter stood still, her scars hidden, her bracelet glinting faintly under the lights, her silence steady as stone. And the question burned hotter than ever in every corner of that hall. Who was she really? How do you carry someone when the world is burning around you? Rivera had been down, blood seeping fast, his body half buried under debris from the blast. The dust hung heavy in the air, choking, thick enough to sting her eyes. She didn't see the fire behind her. She didn't see the silhouettes darting across the ridge. She saw only him, his uniform torn, his lips pale, his breath shallow. Her knees hit the ground hard. She didn't notice. She tore open her kit, hands already working before thought caught up. Tourniquet high, pressure on the wound, morphine in the arm. Her voice low, steady, defying the chaos. "You're not leaving me, Rivera. Not today, not here." He looked at her, panic flickering in his gaze, but she didn't give him time to spiral. She pressed, tied, wrapped, sealed. Her body bent over his as gunfire cracked overhead. And then orders, shouts, the frantic call to pull back. The squad was falling into defensive positions, dragging the wounded they could reach. Someone yelled for her to move, to get out of the line of fire. But she stayed, because Rivera wasn't moving on his own. Her hands were slick with blood when she looped his arm over her shoulders. He was heavier than anyone her frame should have been able to carry, but she didn't stop to calculate weight. She just lifted. Her legs screamed, her back bent, her lungs burned. Step, drag, step, drag. Bullets hissed, kicking dirt into her face. The air was a furnace, thick with smoke. Rivera moaned, slipping in and out of consciousness. She tightened her grip, her jaw locked, her teeth grinding against the weight of him. Not until the last wounded man is safe. She had said it once. She repeated it now in her head, a vow louder than the gunfire. 200 meters. That's what they told her later. 200 meters she had carried him under fire, every step a gamble, every second a miracle. In the hall she stood still, silent. The cadets who had mocked her shifted uneasily in their seats, sensing there was more to her than the papers in front of her. They didn't know yet, not the details, not the cost. But some did. The veteran in the third row leaned forward, eyes narrowing, recognition dawning. He had seen men carried like that. He had known the smell of blood mixed with smoke. He could feel it now just looking at her, the stillness that comes only from someone who has stood in the fire and chosen to walk back into it. Emily Carter didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence was starting to do the work for her. But inside, she wasn't untouched. She remembered the aftermath. Rivera lying on the stretcher, whispering a name she didn't recognize. Her own hands trembling in the dark of the medical tent, finally free of witnesses. The weight of what could have been lost pressing down on her chest until she thought it would break her ribs. She had cried then. Quiet, controlled, head bowed into her palms. No one saw. That was the way she preferred it. Her pain wasn't for display. And yet here she was, years later, standing in a hall full of strangers who thought she had never carried more than paperwork. Her scar itched beneath her sleeve, as if the flesh itself remembered the shrapnel tearing through it. She kept her arm still. She didn't roll back the fabric, not yet. Because there was more. It wasn't just Rivera. It was all the others. The boy from Kentucky who had begged her to tell his mother he was sorry. The sergeant who had gripped her hand so tight she thought her bones might break, terrified of closing his eyes. The Afghan child whose tiny body fit in her arms, his blood staining her uniform while she whispered in Pashto to keep him calm. These were the ghosts she carried, not medals, not ribbons, ghosts. And though the crowd saw only a modest woman fiddling with papers, she stood surrounded by them. Their weight steadied her. Their memory gave her voice, even in silence. The cadet who had mocked her the loudest glanced again at his friends, smirk faltering. He didn't understand it. Why did it feel like the air itself had shifted? Why did his own laughter sound hollow now? Emily Carter finally raised her eyes just briefly, scanning the hall. Not a glare, not defiance, just presence. Some looked away. Others stared back, caught, unable to turn. Because in her eyes there was no arrogance, no need to prove. There was only something heavier, something they couldn't quite name. It was patience, it was endurance, it was memory. The whispers had quieted now. Not gone, but quieter. Doubt was giving way to unease. And still she hadn't spoken. Because she knew the story wasn't finished. Not for them, not for her. And the hall waited, leaning forward into a silence that had begun to feel like a storm holding its breath. Emily Carter adjusted the microphone again, her fingers brushing the scar beneath her sleeve. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, softer than they expected. "My name is Sergeant First Class Emily Carter," she said. "I was a medic in the United States Army." It wasn't loud, it wasn't fiery. It was steady. And it was only the beginning. What happens when silence isn't enough? The hall still buzzed faintly, a low hum of disbelief clinging to the walls. Her quiet introduction, her name, her rank, her role, hadn't landed with the weight some expected. A scoff broke the stillness, sharper than the rest. She probably never even carried a ruck. It came from the cadet in the second row, his voice just loud enough for others to hear. Laughter rippled, not wild but cruel in its restraint. A few veterans shook their heads, but they didn't intervene. Others folded their arms, waiting for her to prove them wrong or prove the whispers right. Emily didn't flinch. She lowered her eyes to the ceremonial display on the table beside her, the folded flag, the boots, the helmet, the rifle. Her hand brushed across the M4 with the familiarity of someone who had once carried it until her shoulders ached. For a moment, she paused, her fingers resting on the weapon like a silent memory. Then she lifted it free. Murmurs rippled, brows furrowed. What was she doing? With the same calm precision she had carried into firefights, she checked the chamber, cleared the weapon, and set it across the podium. The steel gleamed under the lights, its presence heavy in the otherwise ceremonial space. And then she did something no one expected. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a strip of black cloth, and tied it firmly across her eyes. Gasps filled the room. A few chuckled, convinced she was about to embarrass herself. The cadet smirked again, whispering, "This should be good." But then the clatter of metal. Her hands moved fast, precise, practiced. Bolt carrier, charging handle, upper receiver. Piece by piece the weapon came apart in her hands, not fumbling, not guessing, flowing. The rhythm of someone who had done this blind before, not once, not twice, but countless times. The laughter stopped. Silence pressed down, broken only by the crisp sounds of metal on wood as she laid each part on the podium. Less than 2 minutes later, the M4 was in pieces, stripped clean. She didn't pause. With the same calm confidence she began reassembling. Click, slide, lock, tap. The sounds were sharp, surgical. Her fingers knew the path even when her eyes could not. When the final piece slid into place, she racked the charging handle, shouldered the weapon blindfolded, and spoke into the microphone. Some of us carried more than rocks. The silence that followed was absolute. Emily untied the cloth, laid the rifle gently back on the table, and adjusted the microphone as though nothing unusual had happened. Her voice came steady, almost soft. "I didn't come here today to impress anyone. I came to talk about what happens when war follows you home." Her words hung for a moment, Then unexpectedly she shifted. Her English slipped seamlessly into Pashto, the cadence smooth, the tone gentle. A phrase, then another. Officers leaned forward, veterans stiffened. It wasn't memorized, it was lived. She let the words roll a moment longer, then translated quietly. It means, sit still, little one, you're safe now, I'll stop the bleeding. A chill rippled through the audience. Those weren't just words, they were echoes, memories carried in another language. Words she had spoken not in classrooms but in villages where children bled from wounds they never should have had. Her sleeve slid back as she shifted, the jagged scar across her forearm catching the light. Pale, raised, unmistakable, a wound born of fire, not accident. Gasps now audible. Emily raised her arm fully, showing it without drama. Her voice remained even. I didn't get this typing reports. The words landed like a hammer, heavy, undeniable. The cadet who had mocked her stared at his boots, face burning. The veteran who had muttered earlier shifted, eyes fixed on the scar. Soldiers who had laughed now sat frozen, silence pressing into their shoulders. The room was changing. The doubt that had filled it minutes earlier was evaporating, leaving something heavier in its place. Emily Carter stood calm at the podium, her scar revealed, her voice soft but unshaken. The whispers had died, the laughter was gone. And yet, she hadn't even told them the full story. Not yet. The hall waited, breathless. Because everyone in that room now understood. Whatever she said next would decide everything. What breaks a silence heavier than stone? A chair scraped against the polished floor. Slowly, deliberately, an older officer rose to his feet. His uniform was immaculate, his medals heavy, his posture sharp despite the tremor in his hands. Silver hair caught the light. His face was carved with years of command, yet in that moment it was filled with something else, recognition. The hall shifted, every eye turning toward him. Colonel Daniel Morris. Decorated, respected, a man whose name carried weight in every corner of the service. He stood with his gaze fixed not on her scar, not on her soft voice, but on her wrist. The paracord bracelet. His breath caught, his jaw tightened. For a long moment he said nothing, the silence stretching, the audience waiting, unsure. Then finally his voice broke through, low but steady, carrying across the hall like gravel rolling over steel. That bracelet, he whispered, where did you get it? Emily glanced at her wrist, then raised it slightly. Her voice, calm and even, filled the stillness. It belonged to Private First Class Jason Rivera, Helmand Province, 2010. Gasps cut through the air. The name hit like a stone dropped in water, ripples spreading fast. Some veterans froze. Some lowered their heads. Others clenched their fists as if the memory itself had weight. Colonel Morris's face changed. In an instant, years fell onto him, dragging his shoulders down. He swallowed hard, his voice breaking in the quiet. Rivera was one of mine. The words cracked in the air, heavy with memory. His hand trembled as he pointed toward her, his voice rising, stronger now, charged with the weight of truth. I was there that day, the valley. We were ambushed, pinned down. Rivera was hit bad. We thought he wouldn't make it. The colonel's eyes glistened. He breathed unevenly, pausing only long enough to gather himself. Then he continued louder, every syllable carrying into the marrow of the hall. And then this medic, this soldier. She ran through gunfire, through mortars, through hell itself. She dragged Rivera back, shielded him with her own body, and refused to leave him behind. The audience froze. She carried him over 200 meters while rounds snapped the dirt around her boots. And when we begged her to evacuate, do you know what she said? The colonel's voice dropped low, thick with memory, nearly breaking. She said, not until the last wounded man is safe. The silence that followed was absolute. Every soldier in the hall understood what that meant. Every veteran felt it cut deep. That wasn't just training. That wasn't just duty. That was something greater, courage born of sacrifice. Colonel Morris's back straightened. His voice steadied. His presence filled the room, not as a man demanding authority, but as a witness to truth. "You don't just look at Sergeant Carter," he said firmly, his eyes sweeping the hall. "You salute her." No one moved at first. The air held, brittle, waiting. Then slowly the colonel's arm rose. His salute was sharp, crisp, unwavering. The effect was electric. One by one, soldiers pushed back their chairs. Cadets scrambled to their feet, shame heavy on their faces. Veterans rose, boots thudding softly against the floor. In perfect unison, the hall filled with salutes, hundreds of hands raised, a forest of respect aimed at the woman they had once mocked. Emily stood at the podium silent, her eyes shining but steady. She didn't bask in it. She didn't smile. She simply returned the salute, precise and flawless. And in that moment, every whisper, every doubt, every cruel laugh was gone. What remained was reverence. How long can a salute last when the weight behind it is too heavy to let go? Colonel Morris's arm was steady now, his salute crisp, unwavering. For a long breath, he was the only one standing. The hall held its silence, the air electric, as if no one dared move until the weight of his gesture had settled. Then a captain rose in the second row. Boots clicked against the floor. His salute joined the colonel. A ripple followed. Lieutenants, sergeants, cadets with flushed cheeks, veterans whose knees ached but who forced themselves upright out of respect. One after another, the entire hall rose until every chair was empty and every hand was raised high. Hundreds of salutes, a forest of hands cutting the air in perfect unison. The very same men and women who had doubted her, who had whispered and laughed, now stood rigid, shame burning in their faces. Their mockery had collapsed into silence. Their doubt had dissolved into reverence. The young cadet who had scoffed, "Why is she even on the stage?" couldn't meet her eyes. His salute trembled, his face red. The middle-aged veteran who had muttered, "Back in my day, this wouldn't happen," stared down at the floor, hand raised, shoulders heavy with regret. Even those who had laughed the loudest stood frozen now, saluting the woman they had once dismissed. The atmosphere had changed. Minutes earlier it had been fractured, half laughter, half contempt. Now it was sacred, the silence of reverence, the silence of confession. Emily Carter stood motionless at the podium, her chin high, her eyes steady. She didn't smile, she didn't gloat. She simply returned the salute, crisp, precise, flawless. It wasn't an "I told you so," it wasn't triumph. It was respect returned for respect. The hall held the salute longer than custom required. Nobody wanted to be the first to drop their hand, because everyone in that room understood this wasn't ceremony anymore. This was witness. Goosebumps rippled across arms, spines stiffened. Even the most stoic veterans felt their eyes burn. Some swallowed hard, their throats tight with memories they had buried for years. Finally, the colonel's voice cut the silence, low, steady. "You see, ladies and gentlemen, this is what a warrior looks like." A shiver ran through the hall. No one doubted anymore. Not a single whisper remained. Emily lowered her hand slowly, the salute complete. But the silence lingered, heavy, waiting for her voice. When she finally spoke, it was soft, softer than anyone expected, yet clear, carrying into every corner of the hall. "I was never a warrior because of my strength," she began. "I was a warrior because I stood for my brothers and sisters when they needed me." The words landed like stones dropped into water, sending ripples through every row. Soldiers shifted, cadets leaned forward, veterans clenched their jaws. "I didn't carry rifles to prove anything," she continued. "I carried people, men and women who couldn't walk on their own, friends who were bleeding, scared, broken. That was my mission. That was my fight." Her hand lifted to the bracelet on her wrist. Her thumb traced the engraved letters. Her eyes glistened, but her voice never cracked. "This salute doesn't belong to me," she said, steady. It belongs to every medic who ever knelt in the dirt with shaking hands, pressing bandages against wounds that wouldn't stop bleeding. It belongs to the ones who carried someone out of the fire, knowing they might not make it back themselves. It belongs to the quiet warriors, the ones you may never hear about, who gave everything so someone else could live. The hall stayed still, but the silence was different now. Not doubt, not mockery. Emotion. A captain blinked rapidly, swallowing hard. A cadet lowered his gaze, ashamed of his earlier words. Even the veteran who had scoffed clenched his jaw, his eyes wet as memories clawed their way back. Emily's hands rested lightly on the podium. Her voice softened, but her tone sharpened like a blade. I don't need your applause, I just need you to remember them. Every medic, every soldier, every brother and sister who carried weight you'll never see. That's why I'm here. Not for me, for them. Her words hung in the air, heavier than the silence that followed. The hall had become something else entirely, not a place of ceremony, not a place of doubt, but a place of memory. What happens when silence finally breaks? For a moment, the hall was frozen, every soldier standing, every veteran stiff in their salute, every cadet's face flushed with the shame of doubt turned to reverence. Emily's last words lingered like smoke in the rafters. And then slowly the silence cracked. One pair of hands began to clap, soft at first, almost hesitant, from the back of the hall, then another, until the sound rolled forward like a wave swelling into thunder. Applause filled the space, fierce, unrestrained. Some clapped with tears streaming down their cheeks. Others rose higher on their toes, as if the act itself wasn't enough to release the weight they carried. Veterans pressed their palms together until it stung, their eyes shining with memories they had kept locked for decades. It wasn't applause for Emily alone. It was for the countless medics whose names had been forgotten, whose sacrifices had faded into silence. But Emily Carter was their voice now. She stood steady at the podium, not bowing, not smiling, just letting the moment live. Then something unexpected. The same cadet who had mocked her earlier stepped forward. His salute dropped as he lowered his head, shame etched into every line of his young face. He hesitated, then extended a trembling hand. The applause softened into quiet curiosity. Emily looked at him. She didn't glare. She didn't remind him of his words. Instead, she offered a faint, steady smile. She shook his hand firmly, dignity in every movement. It wasn't victory, it was grace. Others followed. Officers, soldiers, even civilians in the back rows. One by one, they moved toward her. Some offered handshakes, some brief nods, some whispered thanks that barely carried past their lips. Each gesture was an acknowledgement, not of her strength, but of what she carried for those who could not. A middle-aged veteran with gray at his temples stood before her longest, his eyes wet, his voice unsteady. "I should have known better," he said quietly. "Forgive me." She held his gaze, nodded once, and squeezed his hand. No lecture, no judgment, just forgiveness. The line grew, a procession almost, not to worship but to thank, to say with their touch what their words struggled to hold. The colonel remained at the side, his own salute finally lowered, his eyes following her every movement. There was no mistaking it now. This was not ceremony. This was redemption. And still Emily Carter stayed calm, steady, unshaken. Because she knew applause would fade, handshakes would end, salutes would lower. But memory, that was what mattered. And her words had already made sure the memory would last. The hall swelled with clapping again, louder this time, like thunder rolling over mountains. For the first time since her name had been called, Emily allowed herself a breath, a long one, her chest rising, her eyes closing for just a moment. She wasn't smiling, she wasn't basking, she was remembering. Every soldier she had carried, every face she had knelt beside, every name she would never forget. The hall clapped for her, but her heart beat only for them. How do you end a story that was never about yourself? The applause thundered on, echoing off the walls, rising and falling like waves breaking against stone. Yet Emily Carter didn't let it sweep her away. She stood calm, her chin high, her hands resting lightly on the podium. She wasn't listening to the clapping, not really. In her mind, she was somewhere else, back in the dust, back in the tents where cots were lined with bodies too still, back in the villages where frightened children looked up at her with eyes far too old for their age. She was remembering, always remembering. The applause grew until it felt like the walls themselves were shaking. Some soldiers stood straighter, tears streaming freely now. Others pressed hands against their chests, unable to clap but needing to honor her in silence. Veterans bowed their heads, lips moving as if whispering names to themselves, names no one else in the room would ever know. Then slowly, Emily stepped back from the microphone. The clapping softened. The room leaned in, sensing the moment. She didn't give them a long farewell. She didn't need to. Her words were simple, quiet. Sometimes the greatest warriors are not the ones who fight to be seen. They're the ones who carry others through fire and never ask to be remembered. The hall held its breath. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, she added, her voice steady as stone. It simply acts. Her gaze swept the room one final time, not searching for validation, not hunting for respect, simply acknowledging them, all of them, with the calm strength she had carried into every battlefield. Then she raised her hand one last time, offered a crisp, flawless salute, and stepped away from the podium. No music played, no narrator announced her departure. She simply walked off the stage, steady, unshaken, disappearing into the quiet as the hall erupted again, this time not just in applause but in something deeper: gratitude, reverence. For the rest of their lives, those who had doubted her would remember this day. Not because of medals, not because of speeches, but because they had seen what true strength looks like. And as the hall slowly emptied, one truth remained, etched into the hearts of everyone present. The smallest figure in the room had carried the heaviest weight. And she had carried it with silence, with grace, with love. Sergeant First Class Emily Carter was not the warrior they expected, but she was the warrior they would never forget.